the first thing that I'd like us to do is take a look at the workflow changes. And so here I've built a desktop, and to understand the changes that are happening in the desktop, I'm going to switch to the desktop tab here. Just take a look at the structures that I have inside of my desktop. So I built a desktop that's called fxguide right now, okay? And right now it's comprised of two different types of structures that I've combined together. One is a Reels group, something that we introduced in the previous extension, extension 2 actually, of 2015. And effectively you can look at this as a, you know, for those who came from Smoke, as a replacement to the folders that we had in the edit desk, in the edit desk library. So it's a substructure comprised of multiple reels, and I've deliberately color-coded it here so that we recognize what is what. Normally all those things actually of a uniform color. They're gray, but it's up to your discretion to decide whether or not to color-code them. So typically if you have a timeline-centric workflow and you do conform, this is where you start. You start with a reel group, you assemble your conforms and bring them into a Reels group. We'll see that this is something that you can then combine with the newer structure that I'm going to talk about, which is the batch group. Now, in previous versions, prior to 2016, you know, you only had one active batch set up at a time, okay? And if you created a new one, it was actually completely overriding the one that was currently loaded into memory, okay? So there was effectively no persistency of batch. That's actually changing inside in version 2016. And so each one of these green entries, and again, it's me color-coding them so that it's clear, each one of these green entries are actually batch setups that are presently loaded into my desktop. So I can have more than one if I want to. So it's the days of just having one setup loaded in the schematic, and if you overwrite that, it's gone if you haven't saved your desktop. Those days are gone, okay? So let's take a look at, so that structure here is what we call a batch group, okay? If I switch to my schematic, you will see that right now I have a batch group that is presently loaded, okay? And if I double click on this one, it's loading instantly the other, another setup that's associated to it. Double click on another one, it's, you know, shifting between the various schematics as you see, okay? Now, what's interesting is actually this is a structure that has more stuff to it than previously. And to illustrate this, I'm going to temporarily switch to the batch tab that actually focus strictly on the batch group that I'm currently selected, okay? So again, notice that when I double click, I'm essentially loading a setup. All of these are persistent, okay? If I save my desktop, they're all going to be saved with my desktop as part of it. So it's easy for me to kind of decompose something into various shots, each shot being in a batch group, for example. It's totally possible for me to use this structure to do that, okay? So switch back to this particular batch group here and switch to the batch tab. And now, so I'm just focusing really now on this currently loaded batch group. And let's take a look at it at its internal structure. You see that it has two further subdivisions, okay? And essentially, really what you have are two classification mechanisms. We have we're introducing for the first time what we call schematic reels and shelf reels. Schematic reels is a structure in which you will choose to organize the clips that are actively being used in your current batch setup. Shelf reels are clips that you want to associate to your batch, maybe use, but are not effectively being used in your schematic, and you don't want them to crowd your schematic for nothing. Renders actually can be a good example of something that you would want to store inside of a shelf reel. You don't necessarily want them to appear in your schematic. You want them to be associated to your setup, but you don't necessarily want them to appear in your schematic. All right, so let's take a look. So these are actually reels, and this is the thing that's very new in 2016. The batch group actually has a batch setup now effectively has its own reel structure to organize the media that it's currently using, okay? And if I select a clip here, like for example, you'll see that it's actually currently being stored in a schematic reel. And if I switch to my reels view, you will see, so spacebar F3, to switch to my Reels view, you will see now that what happens is that I'm visualizing the reel structure that is associated to that batch setup. So here the color coding is actually respected. Those 3 clips here that you see are currently stored into 3 different schematic reels, okay? And I currently have 3 shelf reels, one for batch renders that I'm presently hiding, and 2 others to store some sky plates and some various elements that I'm not using yet in my schematic, okay? There's a true bidirectionality now that exists between what's in these reels and what's in my schematic. It's the same thing. So for example, if I select a clip and hit the hotkey Alt F, I'm going to be instantly switched to my schematic of the matching batch setup, okay, centered on the clip that I just selected in the reels. I can do the opposite thing. I can actually select a clip here in my schematic, and if I wonder where is it in my reels, in my schematic reel, hit the F key, and I'm turned instantly to my Reels view, and it's actually showing me which clip it is in my Reels. So I can have really a means to classify all the stuff that I have right now in my schematics, and right now it's a very simple setup, obviously, so I'm using far too many reels for what I'm doing. But imagine that if I had things like explosions, smoke elements, graphic elements, Photoshop imports, they could all be stored in separate reels for me to have access to them instantly. And so I really have like the Reels classification, and I have that is concurrent to the way that I organize things in my schematic for my thought process.
So instead of organizational, you have this big pot or area with files in the listing of images that are being used in your schematic or clips that are being used in your schematic. This provides an organizational view. But it's not just organizational, because you can actually do operations now to this clip you have selected right in this Reels view without having to copy it out of batch or back into batch.
Exactly. That's very true. So it's not, the reels are actually fully functional. So again, if I select this clip and again switch back to my reels, this is the selected clip, and let's say I want to do something that I can easily do in the reels, such as, you know, browsing through it and kind of elect which portion of the clip I'd like to potentially remove. Okay. Well, what I can do here is essentially take this particular clip and drop it, and I've just trimmed it, and it's been immediately trimmed in the actual batch schematic. So at this point, this is it used to be like over 500 frames. It's now down to 326. It's performed a gestural edit on the clip that is physically being used inside of an action setup. So again, full bidirectional capabilities. This clip is the same as this one. There's no difference. I can also use the reels to do things that it's very effective at doing, such as, for example, just, and of course, bear in mind that this, you know, I can switch to the player, also full screen player here. Okay, that's the right frame. And let's say I want to just create a copy of that frame. I can do that as well. It's very easy to do. And again, this is, you notice that I dragged it into a schematic reel, the copy. And so again, if I hit Alt F, it's actually going to show me this is the still frame. And you see it's one frame here that I just created from my reels. Okay, so it's fully bidirectional. To the point where even, you know, so I'm going to delete it for now, I don't need it. To the point where I could even, for example, take something that's currently in my shelf reel here. So let's say I'm going to take this particular sky plate, okay? And let's say I want to add it to my schematic. There's 2 ways of doing that. Either I just drag it here and you see it made a move. So from my shelf, it went into the schematic. And if I hit Alt F, you see here it's there. It's been added, okay? The other thing that I could do is instead of doing a move, it's actually doing a copy of the clip. The difference here is that it allows me to have my shelf reel always the same, with all my elements always there, accessible, and do things like swap shots, okay? So let's take a look at this clip in the schematic. It's here. I can connect it there to my action setup. And again, if I go back to my reels, let's say I want to replace it and do a swap shot with this other sky plate, I can simply hit spacebar S and select the clip, and it's done the swap shot. And it's actually, again, it's also changed in my schematic. Again, so it's a very bidirectional concept that is put in place. Everything that you can do in the reels is affecting the clips that are in the schematic at the same time, if providing that they are in schematic reels. The clips that are in shelf reels are clips that are presently not used in the schematic. So very flexible organization tool so that you can bring stuff and organize them, you know, in various elements and actually add them to your schematic as needed. One last thing perhaps that I want to show, perhaps highlight is, so I already showed like, you know, instant access to the player. But one thing that I could also do is, for example, take this, this plate here and switch to the Tools tab and take it into Paint. And then I'm going to pick a destination as a shelf reel for now, okay? And just do something really ridiculous, just a clone brush here that I'm... So bear with me, it's a bit ridiculous what I'm doing, but it doesn't matter, okay? Like I'm cloning fluffy stuff, all right? I'm really happy with that result, okay? So now that I'm really happy with that, I can exit. And this is my clip that I just painted. And if I wanted to use the paint version, again, it's the same thing. I can essentially do a swap shot. So hit spacebar S and select the painted version. It's been swapped into my action setup. If I go back to my schematic, you will see here that this is indeed the painted version that was happening. So it's very easy for me to take something into a tool because sometimes it is the fastest way to actually achieve something. There are tools that are faster than their batch node counterparts to do very quick operations like a deinterlace. Sometimes it's just easier to deal with it with the tools than dealing with it with a node. You have essentially full freedom to do these and combine these things together. Of course, because this is the same thing as this particular clip in the schematic here, it also means that when you're in the reels, when you select the clip, for example, any editorial operation that you perform here is actually going to be reflected also directly. So at this point, we have a full triangle. Finally, that's there. So for example, if I decided to do a cut at this particular point, it's performing the cut here in the reels, but it's also performing the cut on the actual clip that's in the schematic. In the batch schematic. So it's all totally bidirectional. So really you can have the timeline to instantly perform editorial operations that are best viewed in a timeline. You can perform gestural operations with using the reels because it's very visual and you see more than one clip at a time. And of course you can use the schematic to organize your thoughts and create your flow graph as you did before. All of this is now part of the batch group, and when you actually create a snapshot of that, or what we call now an iteration, we will see that actually, so this is the new button, it's called Iterate, so snapshot is actually gone. I'm sorry about this change of vocabulary, but this is effectively the same thing as doing a snapshot. So if I click Iterate, here it's actually saving now, it's starting an iteration mechanism, and you see that it's beginning to increment, my setup. So if I now make any changes to that setup, like add an extra source into my schematic and do an iterate again, it's going to ask me, just like with a snapshot, do I want to increment or not? And if I start incrementing, there you go, the counter is there, it's happening automatically. And now I don't even have to see where my snapshots are located. They're effectively part of the batch group, okay? But if I want to track back to the previous version, there's a drop down here, and I just switch back and it asks me if I want to replace or append. If I hit replace, I'm back to the version where I was before, and I can get back now to my second version, replace again. There you go, my clip is here, the one that I added. So it's a very easy way to do a very quick incrementation of your work and have it automatically abide by automatic numbering scheme that you have here. It's fully tokenized, so you can actually decide how you want your iterations to be named and automatically incremented. And there's actually a wide variety of tokens that we now add. I want to point out also that the render node actually by default keeps track also of the iteration that actually generated it. So it's actually normally going to respect the name. It's actually going to respect the name. So if I here select batch name, for example, here, what you have the certainty of is that it's actually going to, at this point, automatically store the name of my batch setup in the render node, but I can also add the iteration to it. So at that point, you see it's actually going to tell me which iteration. So if you want to change it, you can just click on it. It shows you actually what the tokenized naming is, and for example, separate it with an underscore here. And there you go. It's actually going to automatically increment with the iteration number. So again, like a sophisticated tokenized naming system that will allow you to make sure that anytime you render something into a shelf reel, for example, the clip will actually have in its name a track record of which iteration actually generated it. So this is to make sure that you can track back always to the actual setup that generated if you had no history attached to it, okay? So anyway, so this is, again, like a big departure to compared to what we had before. I really think that this is a nice closure, I think, on the overall desktop workflow. One thing also that I want to add, so you've seen the structure. We have the schematic reels here that I've color-coded, the shelf reels that are here. You can add as many as you want as the complexity of what you're dealing with grows. And it's also important to note that if I get back to my desktop, okay, when I toggle the visibility status also, you see that my reels are actually also updating with the actual batch setup that uses those sources. So for example, if I select batch shot 22 at this point, okay, and I switch back to the schematic, it's actually the schematic of batch shot 22 that I'm looking at, okay? So there again, so it inherits also one of the behaviors, the visibility behaviors that we introduced way back in the anniversary release that is applicable. So toggling the visibility status is also updating the batch setup simultaneously. Now, why would you still want to have something like a traditional reel group? And one good use case, for example, would be because you always want to have your current master to be displayed in your desktop. And so there's a hotkey now, Alt-P, that essentially allows you to pin a reel. The pinning mechanism is something that was actually introduced in the extension of 2015 extension. There's a hotkey now that allows you to do that very quickly. And if I toggle back to my shot 10 of earlier, okay, you will see that now I have my I have one of my reels, the reel that I pinned with my master edit that's pinned at the bottom of my desktop. So if I look at this is the reel that I'm more interested in. And so this could allow me, for example, to perform swap shots between what's in here in this timeline and renders, for example, that would be specific to a specific batch setup, okay? And again, bear in mind that as I switch between batch setups, my pinned reel stays always here at the bottom. And contrary to previous releases, I can also pin more than one if I wanted to. So if I go back to my masters and if I wanted to pin another reel, for example, I could go ahead and again hit Alt-P, and this is actually going to pin two reels now. And if I switch back to my shot 10, you see now I have two reels that are pinned simultaneously from my master reel group. So this is a very effective way. You can use it in any scenario. I mean, if you wanted to use a reel group to store a whole bunch of sources that you want to use between multiple shots, you could also use it like that, okay, and just copy them into your current batch setup as you need them in the schematic reels or in the shelf reels, or if you want to keep track of various batch shots in reel groups and swap the renders back into your master timeline. This is also like a strong use case that works very well. If you want to unpin something, normally hitting Alt P again should do the job and remove the pinning at any point in time, so you can decide which one you want to keep and which one you want to remove from your view, from your Reels view. In a nutshell, I think we've kind of gone over some of the major workflow changes. If you save your desktop, of course, it saves everything that I just showed you. So remember, in a batch group, you not only have the reel structure that is saved as part of the batch group, the setup, so the current iteration that you're working on, but all of the iterations also that you saved are part of the batch group. The renders, if you choose to save your renders into a shelf reel, will also be part of the batch group, but you're still free to save them anywhere you want. If you want to render to a library, it's still possible. If you want to render to a reel group, a regular one, you can. It's just that we've added the possibility of actually rendering to an actual shelf reel. Okay, and there you go. By default, this is how it's configured, but you're totally free to decide where you want to render stuff. So there's a lot of flexibility there, and when you say the desktop, it's all of your batch groups, all of your reel groups that are part of the desktop that get saved together. Okay, but of course, nothing stops you if at any point in time you wish to only save one specific batch group into your library. You can do that. You can drag and drop it. You can drag and drop it into the libraries just by essentially taking the structure and dropping it into any library, and it's going to do the job normally. There you go, it appears there. And okay, so you're free to work with something that's completely desktop-centric, or decide to just bring the batch structure into your reels and then work from there. So again, big change, I think, and big finally closure on the overall desktop workflow. And hopefully this is something that tested very well with people who like desktop-centric workflows. For those who are primarily working with BFX, it doesn't really change much to what they do. They can continue to work pretty much the way they did. This is definitely not the biggest news for them, but much more so, I think, for people who have more like who are used to actually bringing stuff into batch as a view.